So it's my pleasure to introduce one of my co-organizers, our volunteer today, and for the last weekend. You might have seen Vlad running around taking photos of all the speakers. We did not make him take his own photo for this session. We let someone else do it. Vladimir is an IT teacher and cloud architect from Brisbane, Australia. He is helping the developer community down here in Australia by looking after local Drupal and WordPress meetups, organising conferences and running training and mentoring sessions. If you happen to catch the closing notes yesterday, you might have heard Vladimir announce that he is going to be the lead organiser of WordCamp Brisbane 2025. Woo! So make sure you check that out. Keep an eye out for the call for volunteers. I think call for sponsors is already out. Is that right? And hopefully we'll see some of you up on stage in June next year at WordCamp Brisbane. Vladimir is an open source contributor working on various projects, including Bootstrap, WordPress, Docker, and Drupal, to name a few. So today, Vlad's going to be talking to us about 10 things that he has learned from teaching WordPress in college. And I, for one, am really excited to catch this talk. So without much further ado, Vladimir, take it away. Now, I'm holding onto this microphone, is that right?
If you want to, yeah. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I already found a mistake on my first slide, so and I'm the only person who is standing between you and a lunch. So we'll make it quick. We only have 40 minutes, but it's kind of going the topic of the Halloween. It's kind of a cursed talk. I proposed it a number of times. And it's the third time it was accepted, but the first time I was able to present it due to various reasons. I'm not going to go into curse part of it. So first and foremost, we are presenting on a Gadigal land. I would like to pay acknowledgement for traditional custodians of the land. I'm from the land of Turrbal Yagara people, which is known as Brisbane or Meanjin. That's me, reading some books. And as mentioned, I do contribute to open source, and I teach a lot, privately and publicly. But I want to take you on a bit of a road trip back a couple of years ago. So 2022, any memories of 2022? For me, it was very slow, work-wise. But there are a few things happening here and there. We lost a monarch as a country. As a crazy dictator decided to invade Europe. Our prime minister tackled the kid, and then the government kicked out the tennis star. Remember those things? And a Hollywood celebrity slapped another Hollywood celebrity on the stage. That was big news. But it was pretty slow for me in terms of work. So I decided to become a certified teacher after teaching about 10 years of different IT subjects, mostly open source. So I joined a local TAFE. TAFE, it's a college. It runs by a government regulation, doesn't operate like a private college, in case you're watching from overseas. And it actually the courses have to follow the government setup courses, not necessarily line by line, but in what they teach, they should be able to tick off. So government says, well, like in IT professionals, this is a set of courses you can teach, and depending on the state, that's what TAFE does. So I set up my fancy Nook with a tractor calendar I got from Europe. And I taught a different disciplines. So certificate, that's your introductory level IT certificate, 3 certificate 4, so you won't get a development experience there, but you get exposure to a lot of things like CMSs, like WordPress. There's diploma, which kind of gets you tapping into beginning of the software development, and advanced diploma that throughout the 2-year course kind of can take you to become a software engineer. That's me with my tag. And it was simple exchange. When I start a new work, I always ask, what do you want from me? So the exchange is simple because TAFE is regulated by government. They always look in feedback from the industry. So around industry dinners. They ask industry what they want. So that was kind of a good thing because, again, the year was slow. And I thought, why not? I'll give them some feedback. I can do it without teaching, but without knowing what you can actually, how you can suggest something. So I spent that 12 months teaching throughout 2 semesters. So what are we going to talk today about? Today we're going to talk about the 10 things I learned from teaching. What were the pros, the cons, and set of recommendations basically that I prepared for TAFE, and then taking my 10-year-old experience in teaching, I kind of put in the perspective of the industry as well as in the perspective of us as open source communities. Let's go back 20 years ago. Why? Because in 2004, I graduated from the uni. So the things were quite different from now. So I used the library. I actually need to go to the library, get a Java book, get the Java book in, sit and code with it. You don't see it these days. There was no GitHub yet, no Git, no social media. So I can waste my time watching the TV instead. There was no chatbot, so you cannot have online friend, only actually real people sitting in chats. And WordPress was 1 year old, just one. So, and in year, well, that was in not 2004, 3 years before that, but Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft, and I recommend you, if you don't know who he is, to go to YouTube and ask Steve Ballmer. You'll definitely recognize him. There are a couple of nice songs remixed onto his speeches. He was a very marketing guy. He called Linux a cancer. He said, yeah, like this hippie GPL rubbish, Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense in everything it touches. Things are a bit different now, right? We know you don't really go for a Java book anymore in the internet. Git was started in 2005 and GitHub followed 3 years later. We all see it on social media, or most of us, I would say. And our best friends are chatbots, maybe. You go to insurance company website and start talking with the chatbot. And yeah, WordPress matured and it's now 20 years later, it's 21 years old. Right? And if you look at the news, now Microsoft's saying that Azure Linux is general availability, and you can go and use it with other Microsoft technology, plonk it all together. We love Linux. Only took 20 years. So what we're going to focus today? I am going to focus on open source, as I'm an open source advocate. I am going to focus on the good development practices. And I am going to touch on generative tools someone decided to call intelligence. And also this talk, I bring in stuff that I wish I learned in uni as well. Session goals, we're going to highlight the issues that I think are there with the industry for graduates and for people we teach, junior developers. I'm going to share the teaching experience I have, not necessarily from the college, but from time before that and currently. I'm going to give industry recommendation, what I think they should do for each of the points. And I hope it's going to initiate some discussions so we can talk about it afterwards, or whoever's watching it can actually take it up, the flagpole, and maybe things will change. Who is it useful for? Obviously, students and teachers. So I did write it with a focus on academia, but I'm also talking about mentors, because when we are software developers, we are mentors. We are best learning by teaching. And pretty much anyone who is in the IT industry, because I think there are a couple of interesting insights there. Okay, let's go to number 1 tool. So proprietary vendor dominance. What does it mean? It means when I was in uni, Microsoft was pushing their MSDN library. It was kind of a subscription you get with your ID, development tools, and all sorts of documentation you can use with those development tools. These days, Adobe and Microsoft are still dominated the industry. Not only academia, but many other things. They give away some for free and cheap, and and give students ability to actually use their tools. Is it good or is it bad? I don't know. Visual Studio Code showed that Microsoft can actually do open source well. Obviously, it's bringing more people to use their tools, but hey, why not if it's free? And so I don't necessarily have to go to university to use Visual Studio and paying for it, like that was the case in 2004. That's a good thing. I think it's also a bad thing because when they dominate in the market, we are lacking the visual part of the alternatives, right? So PHP Storm, I use it on a daily basis. Again, some alternative, you also need to pay for it. Also proprietary software, but I haven't seen it in a single university or college. Has anyone?
Only because I use it in front of my students and then they download it.
Yeah, but did they use it?
Yeah, some of them did, yeah.
Okay, cool. Here we go. So, pros of the proprietary variant dominance. Student use industry tools. Other degree I did is audio engineering. So the tools used to be very, very expensive. You cannot just go and buy it like you do now. Start mixing stuff. You actually need to get access to a software that came with a hardware that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And this is a good thing because you are learning the industry way. But it also trickles down in the industry, right? If you only learn in Microsoft, if you only learn in Adobe, eventually you're probably going to take this knowledge and apply it somewhere in the industry. So not necessarily the best thing, but there are pros and cons. It's not all doom and gloom. So the question is, who are the WordPress main competitors now? You'll probably say Wix, Shopify, but also if you look at the big WordPress websites, there are SharePoint and Sitecore, which, surprise, surprise, lobbied by Microsoft, and there is Adobe Experience Manager, which is obviously Adobe. And the reality is they not necessarily teach those tools at uni, but what do you think the graduate who only learn Microsoft and Adobe gonna look at first? Don't think they're gonna look at the WordPress. Right, so my recommendation, list proprietary tools and technologies beforehand, either in a course book or something like that, and make the list public. Open it up. There's nothing wrong with using proprietary tools. Just make sure people know they're proprietary. Number 2, open source. Open source tools are widely used, which is good. That's the list I used when I was teaching the 12 months. So I taught Python, Node.js, .NET Core, using Microsoft Visual Studio Code. I taught WordPress and Drupal, which is a great list. But throughout my career, the last 20 years, my colleagues, and then the students asking why free? What's the point of creating a free software? Doesn't pay us, takes our time away, and takes, like, what are we getting from it? The answer I give is, I used to give the answer that, well, let's say you're using WordPress, right? How do you know it's working properly? Because millions and millions of people go and test it and report it back and fix it. Now also added the software development principle called reusability. We actually reuse tools. There is a tendency in juniors and graduates to write things from scratch. They think they know better than the whole baggage of the industry. I've been there myself, wrote things from scratch. Guess where my tools are? I'm using WordPress, I'm using Drupal. So reusability, I'm saying stuff you do is now, in WordPress itself, it's 20 years worth of coding of thousands and thousands of people. Right. Also, open source quite regularly in the industry and in the college is subject of the smear campaigns. I'm not going to go into details. It varies from case to case, but here are the few things that you would usually hear, or students come back to me saying, but open source is not secure, right? Well, maybe it's because the articles like that, where a large federal government organization blames CMS, open source CMS, that they didn't patch it, they actually reveal some information beforehand. Open source is not popular. Well, maybe you should tell it to government of Switzerland, who now open source all their projects. Or maybe you should tell it to Microsoft, who bought GitHub for $7.5 billion. Open source does not pay. Well, maybe you should tell it to a company that powers most of the internet. Right? So pros of using open source. Again, students use industry tools. Software open source tools are industry tools these days. But they also exposed to alternatives. So when I taught WordPress, I brought Drupal in. I actually asked students to do the same assignment in 2 different CMSs, compare them, and write me the comparison. Cons, large competition and steep learning curve. True, not necessarily up-to-date documentation. Large competition, proprietary and open source, which is a good thing, but can be a bit confusing, especially people who just come into the industry. Okay, but we also have big businesses starting open source more and more things. You know, apart from .NET Core and Swift language, we now have AI models as one of the things that businesses starting to open source. My recommendation, advocate open source. It's a great alternative, and we have great tools there. Like everyone start using with the Photoshop, but there are proprietary alternatives there. There is also this thing, which works well for a lot of tasks. You might do a bit more cursing when you use it, but hey. Advocate by doing. Show how to contribute to open source, and we're going to cover that a bit. You know, Microsoft bought GitHub, and it's still the biggest open source repository. Obviously, they bought it for other reasons as well, for big bucks, but it still does what it does best, right? It's the biggest open source repository in the world. Play Mythbusters. Make sure you debunk the fact if you hear someone is actually telling the truth, because students going to take it and, you know, send it away. Use it on the internet and stuff like that. Number 3, source control is an afterthought. That was my biggest recommendation. Not a requirement to graduate. You can literally become a software engineer in 2024 without touching a single Git command. This is, I think, embarrassing. Well, it was for me. Because when I'm hiring a person for my company, the first thing I ask, like, can you use Git? Right? Graduate might never use Git, which is, yeah. And, but these days, we have GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, to name a top 3. It's more than the source control tool, right? Everyone's using Jira, Trello, something like this, so most of those tools are there to do planning for you. So you can do ticket boards, you can do epics, you can do all your agile. Most of those tools are security scanners, like it was covered in a couple of presentations before me. Automation, you can do CI/CD if you're in DevOps and use those tools as well. And these days, they all bring in their generative friends to generate some secure code, as was demonstrated a couple of sessions ago here, that ChatGPT generated some unsanitized code for WordPress, right? But a couple of alternatives here for you. So GitHub, does anyone not have a GitHub account? There you go, a couple of people. So yeah, I would recommend it to get one. GitLab is alternative. Once Microsoft bought GitHub, few people jumped to the GitLab, few projects jumped to the GitLab. And Australian-based company Atlassian brought a Bitbucket, so you have like number of tools, and I would recommend you to go and learn them. You not necessarily have to be a developer. As I mentioned before, there is a ticketing system. Obviously, Atlassian owns Jira as well, but I actually like the simpler boards to use, well, GitLab boards to use. So the actions I took: use source control for every subject, even if it's not a requirement. Same goes for the project. Use the source control. Put the documentation in there. And I also, for the last 2 years, I did annual address to the students, basically talking them what's open source, what are the industry standards, how to use meetups, and stuff like that. That was the last talk, I think, in August. my recommendations for how to integrate source control. So create account now. Just go check it out, see what it is, see how confusing it is, or maybe not confusing it is. Use it daily if you can on your projects. You don't have to know Git commands these days. You can actually commit and save the code so it won't disappear with your next lost laptop. Read release notes as well. So for example, what I do, the best example is I give is Bootstrap, because I actually put a proper blog. It's not just release notes. But when WordPress is out, click on the release notes. I'm not sure if they're actually on GitHub. They're probably just on WordPress.org. Go and see what's changed. You actually get more knowledge saying, oh, what's this thing? I better investigate that. Peruse issues. GitHub, GitLab, there's an issue queue. You click on that. You can see what people working on the issues. Just go read through that. I'm sure it's not going to make sense in the first time, but trust me, more you do it, better you are at it. The list of issues fixed in WordPress, click through them, see what's changed. If you want to see the code changes, do the code changes, but also recognize. Few people I saw were quite surprised how many security vulnerabilities WordPress have. Surprise, surprise, they are in release notes as well. First-timers issues. WordPress, Drupal, they have tag that says this issue is great for first-timer. So you can actually go and check. It's maybe one-liner change, it maybe documentation change, but you will get a hang of how specific technology uses open source to contribute back. Documentation rules, number 4. Reading documentation is a skill. You know, we buy a new appliance, who opens the manual first? Not many people. Great documentation is rare. I can list Laravel that gets praised for good documentation over and over and over again. There is a reason for that. They spent as much time as development to put documentation together. Good documentation should not be an afterthought. Like, you can't release the project and say, I'll put a documentation later. That's like, I no longer accept merge requests from developers if it doesn't have a change to the documentation. Successful projects have good documentation. There's no other way around. You cannot create an awesome project with no documentation at all, thinking, people are going to figure it out. It's easy to use, right? So 2 questions I ask about documentation. Is it easy to find? Is it easy to understand? Have someone to read it. And read it yourself. Try to see. I ask students to read a piece of documentation and then interpret it their own way or build something based on this documentation. Contribution to documentation are very important. I can see more and more projects start lagging. Good documentation start losing the interest. And I think we're going to bring AI that's going to bring people back. And that might be true. Yet to be seen, but I think start with documentation. And again, minimal technical knowledge required to review a lot of documentation. We are all users of WordPress. We know the thing there. We can just go and read it. And if we see inconsistency in documentation, don't let it. Just try to contribute back or find someone who can help you do that. If you find things on Stack Overflow, try to find the same thing in official documentation if you can't bring this information back to the documentation. Or if you find the blog article that explains something very well, either ask the person who wrote it to contribute back to the documentation because it's so good, or try to do it yourself. But it often gets neglected. Read documentation. It's an important skill, as I said. We don't read enough documentation because sometimes you read it, it doesn't make sense. Then it's not a good documentation. Make sure it is easy to understand. To do it better, write tutorials. Ask your juniors to write tutorial so others can learn from a tutorial or teach someone. Update open source documentation, as I mentioned before. Reliance on the generative tools. Hey, halfway through we hit AI. Often called intelligence. It's here to stay. Are you ready? we're gonna do a few. I ask ChatGPT. I don't use ChatGPT very often because I think it's not sustainable. You can read more about it online. But one thing I want you to remember when you're using Gemini, ChatGPT, any other tools is that G stands for generative. It was built to generate things. So I asked ChatGPT a couple of days ago, how many letter Ds are in WordCamp Sydney?
There is one letter D in WordCamp Sydney.
Then I ask it again, are you sure?
Let's double check. In WordCamp Sydney, there are actually 2 letters D, one in Word and another in Sydney. Thank you for prompting me to take a closer look.
And I ask it maybe one more last check.
All right, let's make absolutely sure. In WordCamp Sydney, there are indeed 2 letters D, one in Word and one in Sydney. Final answer, 2 letters D.
But I counted 3.
Let's check thoroughly. In WordCamp Sydney, there are indeed 3 letters D. One in Word, one in Camp, oops, and one in Sydney. You were right, there are 3 letters D in total. Thank you for catching that.
Thank you. Think before you use generative tools in the future. Okay, usage, best example I've seen. The student didn't know how to do things in VS Studio Code. We know the settings menu can, like lead you on to some dark corners of Visual Studio, but they actually went to ChatGPT and said, how do I change the setting in Visual Studio Code? And it replied to them because it had it as a model, and that was the best example. Worst example, tic-tac-toe. I was teaching the .NET class, obviously object-oriented development. I said, we need to write a class. I see one student sitting there doing nothing. I said, are you finished? He said, yes, can you show me? And he showed me this nice, it was a CLI-based game, and it's like flashy and everything's working. And I was like, ooh, can you show me the class that you did? And he's like, what's the class? Certainly example that was awesome. So some students just copy-paste answers, and one of the questions was, let's discuss A and B. And obviously ChatGPT said, certainly, let's discuss it. And they just copy-pasted, so I actually read the answer says, certainly. And security best practices, the talk before me, I'll just have my notes here. So that was enterprise approach to WordPress security, Peter Wilson. Yeah, I mentioned it before, he showed how ChatGPT generated non-sanitized code, basically making it insecure code. So personal reflection, it's okay to write in code from scratch, some small bits. Bad at analyzing the code, turning loops, refactoring the code, very, very bad. You actually have to spend more time refactoring what it refactored. And I ask people the questions, especially students, am I hiring a software engineer or prompt engineer? Because with those tools, the next question we're probably going to be asking is, building industry has to follow government regulation, and maybe soon, because of that, the IT will do the same. We have to do the buildings properly. Like, college introduced the AI tool to determine AI content, then they backflip on it the semester later, because there was a lot of false positives, and obviously it just shows how immature we are in this area. Ability to read code. Number 6, when I hire a developer, I expect developer to be able to read the code. Everything I talked to you about documentation, that would lead you to be able to read my code, analyze it, see the bad code and refactor it. You won't get it overnight, but it's a skill. It's a skill you develop to become a better developer. Learn to read code. Obviously, it's not like you pick up the dictionary and read your favorite word, right? Comes with the examples. Check out the release notes. Maybe you found some bug, or ask, if you are not software developer, ask them. There was plenty of presentation. Luke just did a great talk about contributing back plugins, and he showed some code examples there. They're easy to understand one-liners. Learn to read code, it's a great skill. What I realized is students don't read errors. First error they see, I have an issue. What's the issue? I don't know. Can you read me an error? We literally went from, can you read me an error? By the end of the semester, they said, oh, I know this error. I know how to fix it. So it's a skill. You cannot just read the error and say, I know how to fix it. No one can. But reading is very, very important. So recommendation. For teachers or for mentors, start lesson with the code. It also will help. So the next couple of recommendations, including ability to read the code, it also will help to find the AI tools. As I said, they're great for generating stuff from scratch. So start with a piece of code, like math class, start with an example. You don't invent the example and then solve it. You start with a piece of code just trying to analyze it, right? Introduce find an error exercise. Give them the bad code. See if they can find an error. Number 7, group assignments. Another great tool I found to find the generative AI tools. Because, guess what? Once we're back in real life situation, it's very easy to disconnect. People sit their headphones. Some people sleep at the classes. People on the mobile phone. So disconnection is very big when you're actually trying to deliver something as a group. The engagement level is a bit bigger. Like, if I read the lecture for 3 hours, yeah, I can be a bit monotonous. I don't know how, what's the life situation of this student or that student, but I know that I can engage them a bit more with a bit of a code snippet, a bit of work. And when they present it together, it makes them to actually work as a team, which I'm looking for when I'm hiring a person again. Pair programming. So basically, you sit down with the person and help them to go through the code. You do that with the junior developers. Why not to do it in universities and colleges? It's a great tool. I'm still doing it 20 years in. So recommendation, work together and present together. At work, juniors comes in, I was like, in a month, you're gonna present to me about this and that, right? We have Wednesday or Friday afternoon show and tell, do a 3-minute talk. At the meetup in Brisbane, we are encouraging people, we give them the list of plugins saying, can someone look at this plugin, come back and tell your experience? You don't have to be coder, but you have to start learning and exploring new things. Again, pair programming is great because first you sit with someone and then someone you said, they saw how you taught them, so they would use the same thing to actually go and teach someone else. The first day at my full-time work I had as a C++ developer, they didn't know what to do with me, so they shouted me to this guy, David. He was a great guy, PhD, wrote a lot of code, but David said, okay, I have this interface here, can you go and change it? This is how to get source code. That's my first lesson in the industry. I don't want to give that lesson to anyone else. Allow to review each other's work. Again, makes them good at reading stuff. So each other's code as well. So it's not like maybe write a little review as a code review. Give a suggestion. An open source assignment, that's something that I didn't have enough time, but I have a vision of actually creating, for example, a WordPress plugin and giving each student a separate task. Why not? Helping students to improve the documentation, show them how it's done in the WordPress. So by the time they graduate, they already contributed a bit of code. Sorry, do you have a question? Number 8, use real-life examples. Use tenders. Anyone who filled in a couple of tenders in their lifetime? Couple of people? It's a tedious and horrendous task. I won't recommend it to anyone unless you really like it. But there are a lot of open portals where the government goes and put very, very boring tenders. And some of them are quite good. So while I was in COVID, I filled in a number of tenders. I wish to take this time back, but I can't. And I didn't win any, so it's even worse. But what I got from there is actually what government wants. So I use real-life project in the assignment. And one of my favorite projects is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority annual report. So they produce this annual report, I think, about every 2 or 3 years, about how reef is doing, how it's slowly getting well, and all that stuff. And it's a nice piece of document which includes tables and paragraphs and images and copyright stuff. The best source you can use to give for assignment, to learn WordPress, to learn Drupal. And actually, so I did a couple of chapters for WordPress, a couple of chapters for Drupal, and one of the students got very angry saying, is it for assignment? And I said no, but because he didn't read it, that was actually part was for assignment. He got angry and ran away from the class. That was kind of one accident, but the rest of them took their time, learned the tools, learned Tiny MCE, then they learn CK editor that's used by Drupal. Then they start comparing the tools, and that's also a great example how you can actually show what really life is. Before that student storm out of the room, I asked him one thing. I asked him, if your boss asks you to do the same task, converting PDF into a web, are you also going to stand up and run away from your work? He didn't answer. He said, I had enough. But use relatable examples. This is a real tender. The example, they ask you to convert the PDFs into effective web presentation. They actually still published the next one in PDF, and I haven't seen the web version yet. But again, compare the real tools. Compare it to open source tools. Compare proprietary and open source tools. It gives students bigger tool set to work in the future. And you will also learn stuff there as well. Number 9, no awareness of industry events. Where are we? We're in university. How many people from the university are here? That's exactly what. 1. Where? Hello. Welcome. I don't want to single you out. I'm just saying that at the majority of the events, regardless where they are, there's no awareness. Students are not aware what's happening around them. They're not aware of meetups. They're not aware of conferences. So put your beginner's hat on. My goal for the last couple of years was try to think how to bring more in students. And for the WordCamp Brisbane, what we're trying to do, we're trying to run it in TAFE, because I have some connections there, obviously. And we're trying to make either cheaper entry for students or at least promote it inside, because it would be great to have posters, right? WordCamp posters here, so we have more juniors and more students coming in. And doing all this stuff. Obviously, conferences can be expensive. My recommendation always for the first-timers, WordCamps and DDDs are a must. So WordPress Brisbane coming in June 2025, we will try to keep prices as low as we can. This is our goal. DDD, I haven't found DDD Sydney since 2019, so there's something happened here. But there's DDD Brisbane in December, and DDD Melbourne is February, and there's DDD Perth, stands for Developers, Developers, Developers. Mostly, again, Steve Ballmer reference. I hope he's all right. There's Perth, Adelaide, I think, is happening. The best thing about it is $50 entry fee. And you learn about CI and testing and project management. And they actually bring quite a good speakers for $50. It's a great event. So if you have a junior develop, send them there if you're in that town. Really good event, right? GovHack, hackathons. We don't have a community day at this conference this year, but usually WordCamps do have a contribution day. We might be exploring this option for Brisbane. Usually about 10 to 15% of the conference goes there, mostly code contributions. But again, I'm promoting a lot of documentation contributions as well. So GovHack, the biggest hackathon, I think, in Australia, sponsored by government. Lots of regional locations, lots of major locations happening in September. It's a great event to go to because you're not only learning the code, you actually, only one coder, I think, is on the team. There's project manager and there's a designer. So it's a great tool to work as a team. Recommendations. Watch videos online. Most of the conferences are recording them, including this one. Promote meetups and explore meetups. Just go to a Python meetup for the kicks or Swift or something. Just see what they do there, right? We're on WordPress Brisbane, monthly basis for the last 18 months, and I learned a lot there just by running it. Present at the meetups. Start with 5 minutes. Meetups are there for a platform, and then you can go and present at WordCamp or some other conferences and also volunteer at the conference. That's the easy way to get in. And the last bit is up-to-date portfolio. So, and obviously we're here, probably most of us has an up-to-date CV or something like that, but the students have no awareness of that. No one goes and says to them, you need a CV, unless they're actively looking for work. So tell them what to put in there. Maybe a list of conferences or technologies or meetups they want. Maybe they present it somewhere. Have a discipline to ask the question, even if you think this question is super simple. It's a great tool to get you, start understanding the material of the conference or the meetup. And collaborate on the projects, right? Your GitLab, GitHub boards, if you're contributing the code documentation, is a great tool to do. The WordPress.org dashboard is a great tool as well for your employees to see that, but also for you to reflect on what you've done. So to summarize, lots of work to be done to connect industry and academia, and I hopefully encourage you to do some things or to help someone to actually get a bit better. And the best experience is a real life experience. Do you have any questions? Oh, no, contribute to open source as well. And come visit Brisbane.